I am Brad DeLong. This is DeLongToday, in which I hold forth on my guesses as to what I think you most need to know about what our economy is doing to us right now. Today, why I am pessimistic about the American economic outlook, although not as pessimistic as some. I think there is a rapid way out of the box we are in, but I do not think we will take it. Others, more pessimistic, don't think there's a way out of the box at all. Where to begin? Let's begin back at the start of the 1800s. Let's begin back in 1803. Let's begin back when people were still confused and uneasy about how this thing that was coming to be, this market economy, could or would work. Back then, there was a French economist named Jean-Baptiste Say. Jean-Baptiste Say back then was an up-and-coming young technocrat. It was the early days of the French Revolution and the French First Republic. Remember, we are now and have been since 1957 on the Fifth French Republic, by far the longest lasting of the bunch. Back then, the future looked bright. Back then, Jean-Baptiste Say was special assistant to the French Minister of Finance. Then his patron and his Gironde faction, they lost a struggle with the Montaigne faction among the French Republicans. Say's boss was fired, arrested, imprisoned, probably tortured, and then guillotined. Somehow Say avoided that fate. Say left Paris. Say decided that it was not wise to pursue a career in French government with an eye toward someday becoming finance minister. The tools were too sharp, and the stakes on the downward side were too high. So he stayed in the countryside, and he wrote economics books. And back then, French economist Jean-Baptiste Say assured all his readers that a big demand shortage-driven depression, a general glut, was metaphysically impossible. Quote, "To say that sales are dull owing to the scarcity of money is to mistake the means for the cause, an error that proceeds from the circumstance that almost all produce is in the first instance exchanged for money before it is ultimately converted into other production. Sales cannot be said to be dull because money is scarce, but because other products are so. There is always money enough to conduct the circulation and mutual interchange of other values, when those values really exist. In other words, there's no such thing as a general aggregate supply of everything. No such situation as when there's more being produced of everything than there is demand for anything. What's really happening is that there is excess supply of some goods, but there's excess demand for others, and the economy is not properly incentivizing people and resources to move from those industries where there is excess supply to those where there is excess demand. Now this, at some deep level, this is what the Republican politicians in Washington, D.C. believe, and what those who curry favor with them reinforce. And this is why they continue to block the attempts to get the government involved in boosting spending right now in order to get the economy closer to, rather than risk it drifting further from full employment. And it is far from full employment, and there is substantial risk. Each week these days, an extra 800,000 people who qualify for unemployment insurance get fired and go and start collecting unemployment insurance anew. That's a huge number. And these days, these are primarily businesses that are shutting permanently, no longer people being put on some form of temporary layoff. And the people who are running those businesses that close, they're unlikely to be able to restart. The economy is deeply in depression. But they think if only people were a bit hungrier, had less government support, they would overcome their fear of the virus and go out there and take the jobs that do exist, because there are places where there is enormous excess demand for goods and labor. Yes, they think there is excess supply in hospitality and close personal services and leisure. But that means that the money that would have been spent on restaurants and such is still out there, building up pressure, waiting to be spent on something else. People just need to switch from looking for jobs where the demand isn't to looking for jobs where demand is. Thus, government support would, they believe, not boost but weaken production by lowering people's incentives to go out and look, by making them comfortable when what the economy needs is for the unemployed to be hungry. On this theory, our rate of non-employment for 25 to 54-year-olds, those too old to be in school in large numbers and too young to be retired in large numbers, that is, we have 5 full percentage points fewer of such people at work today than we did back in February. That's the case not because there's a shortage of demand to employ them, to pay their wages if they do to go to work making stuff, but it's because they're not properly incentivized to stop doing whatever they are doing and go looking for jobs in those sectors where there is excess demand. And the economists who want to curry with them, favor with them, know better, for the most part know better. But still they say yes, yes. And on the Republican side, only Steve Mnuchin is in there pitching for an economic recovery program. Now, Mnuchin might win. Trump is on dexamethasone. The Mayo Clinic tells me that severe mental reactions occur in 6% of patients on such steroids, most commonly euphoria and hypomania, the kinds of things that lead you to check yourself out of the hospital against medical advice and then promptly tweet, quote, "I will be leaving the great Walter Reed Medical Center today at 6:30 p.m., feeling really good. Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed under the Trump administration some really great drugs and knowledge. I feel better than I did 20 years ago." Yes, when I have pneumonia, I always feel better than I felt 20 years ago. Let me tell you something that may be a secret. It is in fact a rare day when I feel better than I felt 20 years ago. It's called aging. And I don't even have pneumonia right now. My lungs are clear and my fever is normal. Now, if Mnuchin can get to Trump, Trump may well pass him the baton. People with euphoria and hypomania, they're enthusiastic about doing something. Mnuchin is bringing him something to do. It's the old line from, I think, the television show Yes, Minister. We must do something. This is something. We must do this. This is a genuine silver lining about our situation this week. I'm trying to find genuine silver linings here. But, what if Mnuchin does not win? As indeed he has not been winning for 4 months now. Back in the recovery starting in late 2009, back then when there was no virus, even then the U.S. economy only inched itself back toward full employment slowly, painfully, at the pace of flowing molasses, without the government standing up to buy the products of America to replace the consumer and the business investment committees that had sat down. You look at how long it took the economy to get from its 75% of 25 to 54-year-olds employed up to 80%. It took it 8 years. It took it 8 years, even with the Federal Reserve cheering them on as much as it could with the limited tools at its disposal. It took 8 years, even though there were plenty of workers available and wanting to work and no signs of inflation. Now, little has changed in the structure of the U.S. economy over the past decade. Whatever was going on in the Great Recession is presumably still going on. Whatever shadowed recovery back then shadows recovery now. Back then, the economy was also at the zero lower bound on interest rates. Back then, the Federal Reserve's remaining tools to manage the economy were indeed weak, as they are weak now. And back then, we got an employment recovery. But we did not get a recovery in production and incomes at all. Production and income stayed as far below the pre-Great Recession trend throughout the 2010s as they had been at the unemployment rate peak back in 2009. Think of that. The recovery in employment took place. It took place only very slowly, but the recovery in production and incomes did not take place at all. It was a one-time downward bump in American production and income, and thereafter normal economic growth resumed, but there never was any catch-up. Why no catch-up in incomes and production while there was a catch-up in employment? Because of what happened to productivity. Productivity not only did not catch up to its previous trend, productivity fell further and further behind. And with a constant production gap, a greater productivity gap meant an employment recovery very, very slowly, very, very eventually, but an employment recovery in the sense that we needed more people to produce less stuff than we would have produced had the economy returned to its pre-Great Recession trend. That was really not a win. Now that decade of 2009 to 2019, was one I found to be extremely painful. Not materially, I had a good job, but intellectually and psychologically. I had, I'd been teaching for decades, that the U.S. economy had powerful equilibrium restoring forces in it, that those forces carried it 40% of the way back to full employment for each year that passed after a recession troughed. Look forward 3 years, I said back before 2008, to generation after generation of students, and you can expect that only 1/5 of the gap between the economy's current position and its longer run trend that exists now will still remain. But that, it turned out, is BS. That required that whatever recession was going on be small enough not to totally derange state budgets. And that required that the Federal Reserve be able to respond by cutting interest rates further should recovery flag, and not have interest rates already down at their absolute zero. Those conditions do not apply today. Modern global North economies seem to require not just the normal workings of entrepreneurial capitalism, but an additional goosing from another spending channel to generate a production catch-up to previous trend, or even a maintenance of full employment. That full employment seems to exist only with massive government budget deficits or an incredibly enthusiastic and bubble unrealistic financial market these days. That was a point made by my teacher and friend Larry Summers a decade ago. That, I think, is an accomplishment because he was very, very right, for which he would get the Nobel Prize in economic science, if not this year, in some future years. That was something, a genuine insight that the community would not have had without him. The economy needs more oomph to it. And at the zero lower bound, that additional goosing cannot come from interest rate ease, and it did not in the Great Recession come from expansionary fiscal policy on a sufficient scale, and is unlikely to come now. That is, the way to bet is the same thing that happened in the Great Recession, in which after the recession had reached its bottom, growth resumed, but there was no catch-up, in which growth resumed parallel but below what previous growth was, is about to happen now. We will have next to no additional closing of our output gap, and only very slow closing of our employment gap without the public sector standing up to strengthen demand. The future is uncertain, markets will fluctuate, but that is the way to bet. And that is the way to bet without the virus, without taking account of the virus. And we definitely have the virus. The United States, 4% of the world's population. 21% of confirmed COVID-19 deaths, 5 times our share. 25% of the global North's population. 50% of excess global North mortality that we attribute to COVID-19. Twice as much as our share. 3 times as much excess. No, what we have twice as much. They have 2/3, 3 times as much excess mortality as what they have in the rest of the global North per million people. Current cumulative cases of COVID per million that are recorded are 4 times what they have in the European Union, and we undercount our cases by much more than they undercount theirs. Current cumulative deaths per million are twice what they are in the European Union. And the US continues to lose 1,000 people per day to COVID-19, while the European Union, with 4/3 of our population, loses 300. And the Asian members of the global North lose almost nobody. And it is not a North American thing. Canada has 10 COVID-19 deaths per day. My friend, young whippersnapper Dan Wang, whom I last saw when we had pizza together with my daughter and Noah Smith at Zachary's on College Avenue in Berkeley. My friend Dan Wang writes from Shanghai. Quote, I've spent the past month in Shanghai, which I think is the best place in the world right now. It's always been the most fun and livable city in China, and there has been no transmission of the virus since April, with restaurants, bars, and museums all open for months. If you'd asked me back in 2000, right, when I look back at, say, the 8 years of the Clinton administration and at the U.S.'s recovery in the kind of great, computerization and internet boom of the 1990s and the rapid income growth of then, I would not have thought that anyone sane would, in late 2020, be saying that Shanghai is the greatest city in the world. I would not have thought it in 2008. I would not even have thought it on November 9th, 2016. But, Dan definitely has a point. We have the virus, and that shadows everything. So what does the fact that we have the virus mean for economic recovery? The first thing to note is that what recovery we are going to have from the COVID-19 depression has already happened. The prime-aged employment rate fell from 80.5% to 69.5% of 25 to 54-year-olds during the virus panic crash of the spring. It has since recovered. It is probably at 76.5% right now as of the first week of October. This is now, thank God, no longer a vastly deeper economic depression than the depths of the 2007 and 9 Great Recession. But this is about as deep, and there is very good and strong reason to fear that this is about all of the recovery we are going to get. These extra 5 percentage points of employment, they're people who want to work. They're people who would be eager to work. there is not the demand in any sector to pull them into the socially distanced jobs where we could use so many people right now to do useful things and do not. Why? Well, because of our consumers. We are stuck. We are stuck at about 1,000 new virus deaths per day here in the United States. When deaths go down, people drop their masks and go to bars. When deaths go up, people get scared again. That is where we are. Canada, with 1/10 of our population, has 1/100th of our COVID-19 deaths per day. China, where the reservoirs of the virus are, and China that is those most suspect to outbreaks, China has stomped the virus for months. But we have 1,000 new virus deaths a day or so. Now, 1,000 new virus deaths a day, that means at currently mortality rate, something like 150,000 true new cases a day. If 5% of the population, if 15 million people, if they engage in non-social distance activities on any given day, that means that the risk of catching the virus from such is 1% per day, right? And thus there is an 0.07% chance that if you go to this bar or to that celebratory Rose Garden event at the White House, you will die. And there is an 0.1% chance that you will wind up debilitated for months, if not for life. A 1% chance of going out on the town and giving a hug in the Rose Garden and hanging out for the party for several hours, breathing in lots of unmasked air, means there's a 1% chance you'll have a disease that can be very, very nasty indeed. And that if you catch it, gives a 10% chance of debilitating you, an unknown chance of debilitating you for years, if not life, and a 0.7% chance of killing you. That concentrates your mind. That amount of virus risk will continue to make consumers in the United States very cautious. Cautious in a way that consumers will not be in Japan, in Canada, in Germany, where virus prevalence rates are much, much lower. They can look forward to perhaps having consumption-led recoveries. We cannot. So even if we could count on a rapid recovery and a rapid reknitting of our societal division of labor and employment at full employment in the absence of the virus, the presence of the virus at the high levels found in the United States leaves us with no clear road to rapid and complete recovery, since the consumer will not stand up with the virus still out there and not suppressed, and since we have not even a plan, let alone actions, to suppress the virus. And business investment? Business investment is not standing up either. Would you? That leaves only the government. That leaves only the government to help us close the gap, to help us get employment back to where it should be. But Republican core advisors regard, or in order to curry favor, say that they regard high unemployment and waves of small business bankruptcies and shutdowns as salutary and healthy, improvers of the work ethic in the long run, part of the natural breathing process of the market economy. Will Joe Biden save us? Well, Biden does not seem to be at the point of accepting the federal government's role as employer of last resort in a plague. He might come around to there, but the rest of the global north may well grasp the ring, pull open the door, do what is necessary to have the government stand up, take on the task of employer of last resort, suppress the virus, and so be recovered from the COVID-19 depression by June 2020. I do not see a likely possible future in which that is true for the United States. The United States has a supply shock problem, yes, but we could move people permanently out of restaurant and other close contact businesses into any of the huge amount of socially distanced work that is being left undone in the United States and that could be done. The United States needs to boost demand to pull people out of socially non-distanced and into those socially distanced occupations that are worth doing. And we need to find out what those are, and we can't find out what those are as long as demand is depressed and people aren't out there demanding them. The United States needs to boost demand in a way so that the extra demand flows into sectors that are not virus-ridden, and also into ones in which there is not a hard capacity constraint, in which excess demand goes only into higher prices and not to increased production. It would be a delicate exercise, even with political near consensus, that it should be undertaken. But we have no political near consensus. What are the chances of changing Republicans' minds and getting them to agree to allowing the government to stand up? And the agreement of at least some Republicans to pursue policies of economic recovery will be necessary, for the U.S. system has many, many veto points, and it does require near consensus for there to be rapid action. Well, back in the days when Jean-Baptiste Say and his friend David Ricardo were telling people that a general glut was a metaphysical impossibility, that excess supply of something meant excess demand, strong excess demand for something else, and that there were plenty of jobs if only the unemployed would look for them and take them, they met anguished cries of dissent from their friend Thomas Robert Malthus, who said, "What are we in now, in the year 1819, but in a general glut?" It is a tenet of the new doctrine on profits and demand, Malthus wrote, for the idea that excess supply in one sector meant excess demand in another was indeed a new one. Quote, that if one trade be overstocked, it is a certain sign that some other trade is understocked. But where, Malthus wrote, I would ask, is there any considerable trade that is confessedly understocked, and where high profits have been long pleading in vain for additional capital? The Napoleonic War has now been at an end above 4 years. And although the removal of capital generally occasions some partial loss, yet it is seldom long in taking place, if it be tempted to remove by great demand and high profits. In short, if there were excess demand out there in any sector, businessmen would have found it and hired workers to satisfy it by now. And yet, Marcus goes on, instead of this, we hear of glutted markets, falling prices, and cotton goods selling at Kamchatka, lower than the costs of production. The Kamchatka Peninsula north of Japan being the furthest place from London that Malthus could imagine. Indeed, truth be told, by 1929, Jean-Baptiste Say himself had abandoned his belief that excess supply of one kind of good and service meant there had to be strong excess demand for others. That he had swung around to agreeing with the young John Stuart Mill that the mirror reflection of an excess supply of goods and workers was an excess demand for money. That everyone wanted more cash, and so cut back on their spending in order to hoard more cash, and yet found that that did not work when everyone does it, since one person's income is another person's spending. If all cut back on their spending, all find not that they have more cash in their pockets, but that their incomes have dropped and each of them has the same amount of cash as they had before. And yes, you can, there is a sense in such a situation in which there is an excess demand for goods and services, a situation like today. You can say, well, yeah, there is an excess demand for safe assets. It's not just that there's an excess supply of everything. And you can say that if that excess demand could be satisfied, the economy would rebalance itself at full employment. But do you trust Citigroup or JP Morgan to create a safe asset for you to buy? Do you trust its liabilities, the liabilities of others it presents, to be safe? Nobody trusts an asset created by Citigroup or JP Morgan to be safe these days. You do trust the liabilities of the Federal Reserve to be safe. The Federal Reserve can issue safe assets. The problem is that it's normal operating procedures that all they do is swap one kind of safe asset for another, reserve balances for 10-year treasuries, without adding to the total supply of safe assets and so satisfying the excess demand. The only organization, it turns out, that can create safe assets, that can create 10-year treasuries right now is the federal government. And so we are back to having the federal government print up more bonds and then spend the proceeds buying stuff to cure our current economic malaise. This is the expansionary fiscal policy and the government buying stuff, which is what Republican legislators have been blocking since May. And how is it that a position, a point of view, that a doctrine that its originator, Jean-Baptiste Say, abandoned back in 1829, abandoned 191 years ago? Why is this still settled doctrine and conventional wisdom on the Republican side of not just the political but the intellectual aisle? Go figure. It is a great mystery to me. Now do note that I am an optimist. I see two ways out of this box we are in. The first is to act like a normal rather than a doofus country and suppress the virus. The second is that there's a way through a properly directed expansionary government fiscal policy, even with new virus cases running at 150,000 a day, and with the risk of death if you go to the bar every night for the next 3 months at 0.7% and the risk of debilitation at 10%. We could either do a fiscal policy to get people back to work at socially distanced jobs. We could suppress the virus and get back to normal. Others, however, do not think there is a way out of the box. My friend Tim Doy at the University of Oregon, for example, writes this: while the fall in consumption exceeded the fall in incomes early in this cycle, now on net transfer payments are ending up as forced saving. The virus is the key impediment to growth at this point. There are certain sectors in the economy, leisure and hospitality in particular, with limited prospects until the virus is under greater control. There isn't really a debate on this point. There is simply a non-trivial supply-side constraint on the economy right now. Tim believes that even expansionary fiscal policy would not do a great deal to put this 5 percentage point slice of the labor force back at work. And Tim sees there is no way for the U.S. to do what Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Taiwan, China, Germany, Switzerland, and company have done: suppress the virus. At least not until January. And so Tim is a pessimist. He sees no way out of the box at all. But I see two ways, actually. I see suppress the virus via competent public health or strengthen demand via competent economic management. But we are just not a functional enough country, to take either of those. To take either of those roads. I'm Brad DeLong, and this has been the presentation part of DeLongToday for Wednesday, October 7th, 2020. Thank you.